Hey everybody, how's it going? Aaron Rift here from NoDQ.com. Welcome to WCW Wednesday here on NoDQ.com. This time I'll be looking at the WCW pay-per-views from 1998. At the start of 1998, WCW was red hot. They were still on top of the wrestling world. They were still beating WWE in the Monday night ratings. The pay-per-view buy rates were still through the roof. WCW was a company that seemingly could not go out of business. But as we saw by the end of 1999, things had gone downhill by epic proportions. WCW would completely collapse from the beginning of 1998 to the end of 1999. So this is a very interesting period to see how and why WCW went down so fast. A company that is under the Ted Turner umbrella with millions and millions of dollars behind it. What went wrong? That's what we're going to look at here. Let's start off with the first pay-per-view, 1998, Sold Out. The most notable thing about this pay-per-view was the Bret Hart versus Ric Flair match. This was Bret Hart's first WCW match against one of his old rivals from the WWE, Ric Flair. This was a very good match, and it helped this pay-per-view do a very good buy rate for WCW, considering the fact that Sold Out was not a major pay-per-view. Bret Hart and Ric Flair, that was definitely a draw, and the match was, for the most part, very good. So I would recommend Hart versus Flair. The other big noteworthy thing on this show was the Kevin Nash versus Giant Battle of the Giants, and the big spot where Kevin Nash went to powerbomb the Giant, but he couldn't quite get Giant up enough. Giant had put on some weight. They had done this spot the previous year at Super Brawl, and that went off without a hitch. But this time, it was different. Kevin Nash had picked up the Giant, couldn't get him up all the way, and literally dropped him on his head and the back of his neck. And the Giant got injured and was out of action for about a month or so. WCW did turn this situation into an angle where the powerbomb was banned and Kevin Nash was getting fined, and he kept doing the powerbomb. So that made for some very interesting television. As far as wrestling on this show, I mean, you had some decent wrestling matches. The one really good match I would recommend was Chavo Guerrero Jr. along with Juventud Guerrera and Lismark Jr. and Super Calo against El Dandy, La Parka, Psychosis, and Silver King. Your luchador special. This was just a lot of fun to watch, and this was probably, from a technical standpoint, the best match on the show. Maybe even better than Bret Hart versus Ric Flair. Moving on here, we have Super Brawl 98. This was the big rematch, Sting versus Hogan. Sting finally gets the clean win over Hogan and wins the title back. No controversy or whatever. Sting is the decisive champion after the title had been held up. You had the NWO angle where the Steiner brothers broke up. Scott Steiner turned on his brother Rick, and people definitely saw this coming. It wasn't like it was a surprise or anything. Scott Steiner had been acting more heelish over the past several weeks prior to this pay-per-view. Steiner had been, walking out on his brother or being more arrogant in the ring. So the heel turn was definitely coming. It wasn't a big shock or anything. This was the beginning of Scott Steiner transforming from being in a tag team with Rick Steiner to becoming Big Papa Pump. So that was one of the biggest, probably the biggest angle on this show. And as far as match quality, once again, not as strong as some of the previous WCW pay-per-views in terms of the match quality. But I will say that there was one really memorable match with the cruiserweights on the undercard. You had Chris Jericho defending the cruiserweight title against Juventud, and the mask was on the line, Juventud's mask, and he ended up being unmasked. And Chris Jericho was really coming into his own at this point as a top heel in the cruiserweight division and being the cruiserweight champion. Jericho was really building up momentum with his heel turn around this period in early 1998. Moving on, we have Uncensored. Some good matches on this show. Overall, I'd say this was a thumbs up show. Once again, the typical WCW pay per view pattern that had developed by this point, where you had a very good undercard and a terrible main event, and you had Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage in a steel cage. I watched back on this, and I was just shocked at how dead the crowd was for this. You had two of the biggest stars in the industry, and the crowd was just quiet. I mean, there was very little heat for this match, and it was a mess. You had Sting coming out. Randy Savage was having issues with the NWO, and it looked like Savage was going to go babyface, but then he turns on Sting. And the whole thing really made no sense, and it was a mess. So I would avoid the main event. You had Bret Hart versus Kurt Hennig. This was a decent match. Actually, I think it was pretty disappointing compared to their matches in the WWE from SummerSlam and King of the Ring. But it was still a decent match. You had Jericho versus Dean Malenko. Once again, Jericho was on fire with his heel character. And after the match, Dean Malenko was all distraught, and Gene Okerlund interviewed him, and Malenko walked off. So this was a good angle. The cruiserweight division was really strong at this point with Jericho as the heel champion. So I would recommend any of Jericho's matches from around this period. A really entertaining match on this show for the U.S. title. You had DDP versus Chris Benoit and Raven. Just a tremendous brawl all over the place. One of my favorite WCW matches. I would absolutely recommend this one. So moving on here, we have Spring Stampede 1998. Another solid pay-per-view. Actually, I think that this was one of WCW's best pay-per-views of 1998. Maybe the best pay-per-view of 98. A lot of very good matches on this show. You had Goldberg, who was really coming into his own at this point against Saturn to kick off the show hot. It was amazing how over Goldberg got in such a short period of time, and one of the few true homegrown superstars that WCW made. So if you want to see Goldberg when he was at his absolute peak in popularity, where the crowd was just going absolutely nuts for the guy, check out this match against Saturn at the start of Spring Stampede 98. You had some tremendous cruiserweight action on this show. Ultimo Dragon versus Chavo Guerrero Jr. And Eddie Guerrero was doing a really entertaining storyline at this time. He was a heel, and him and Chavo were having their feud. And, Eddie was forcing Chavo to do his bidding. And Chavo was wearing the Eddie Guerrero is my favorite wrestler t-shirt. So, another really entertaining undercard angle. You had Booker T versus Chris Benoit for the TV title, and this was around the time they were doing the Best of 7 series, and anytime Booker T and Benoit got in the ring, you had a quality match, so I would recommend this one as well. Raven's Rules for the U.S. title, DDP versus Raven, another awesome match. These two worked really well together as they did it uncensored, and at this pay-per-view as well. And this was really when Raven was at his peak in WCW. He was doing really well, and he would win the U.S. title here. And he was red hot. He had the flock. He was a big star in WCW. He had a lot of momentum at this point as well. And then you had the main event matches. Once again, typical pattern. Match quality, not so good. You had a baseball bat on a pole tag team match, and this was pre-Russo. You had Hogan and Kevin Nash against Roddy Piper and the Giant. This was interesting to watch, not because it was any good, but it was the start of the breakup between the NWO and the split where Nash and Randy Savage would go off on their own to form the NWO Wolfpack. So in terms of storyline development, this was an important match. And then you had the main event, Randy Savage versus Sting. Savage ended up winning the title, but it would be short-lived. This was actually a week after Raw had finally beaten Nitro in the ratings after 82 weeks, and WCW immediately went into hot shot mode to try to win back the ratings. And the next night on Nitro, Hogan would win the title back from Savage, and Bret Hart would go heel for no reason, just for the fact that WCW wanted to have a major heel turn and do something to boost the ratings. So you did see some cracks in the WCW armor with this Spring Stampede pay-per-view where Not so much on this pay-per-view, but on the Nitro the next night, you could tell that they were really trying to turn things around because WWE had just beaten them in the ratings and the war was back on. Speaking of the war, we have Slamboree 1998. This pay-per-view was very disappointing, and you know it wasn't a very good pay-per-view when the most noteworthy thing was not the matches on the show, but rather the angle with Eric Bischoff challenging Vince McMahon to a match on a WCW pay-per-view. Like I mentioned a few moments ago, WCW really starting to show signs of desperation and trying to turn things around, realizing that WWE was, coming back at them and starting to overtake them in the ratings on a regular basis. And, Bischoff challenged McMahon following the whole DX invasion at the WCW headquarters. So, yeah, it was really weird to see Bischoff out there and all these references to Vince McMahon and Tony Schiavone taking shots at Jim Ross. It just felt like WCW was starting to unravel at this point, and Bischoff was letting Vince get to him. You had the main event matches, which once again weren't very good. You had Bret Hart versus Randy Savage. This was, I guess, a decent match. You had Roddy Piper as a special referee, but once again, Bret Hart as a heel made absolutely no sense. Bret Hart had come off the Montreal Screwjob with a ton of momentum. Everyone was behind him and supporting him. So why would you turn the guy heel? Just one of WCW's many mistakes that they were starting to make at this point in early 1998. And, wasn't really getting this whole match with Bret Hart as a heel. And then you had the World Tag Team titles, Sting and the Giant versus the Outsiders. And this was Scott Hall's heel turn where he turned his back on Kevin Nash. Once again, I think it was done as a ratings ploy to get people to tune into Nitro the next night to find out what happened. Just came out of nowhere, really no build up to it. It was just a heel turn done for the sake of doing a heel turn. All right, next up we have the 1998 Great American Bash. Not a very good show, another forgettable WCW pay-per-view. Undercard was solid, but the main event matches were terrible. There was one above average match on this show, in my opinion, and that was, once again, Booker T versus Chris Benoit in their best of 7 series. This was a very good match. I would recommend it. The main events, I would try to avoid at all costs. You had Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage and Roddy Piper. Lots of star power, but the match itself was terrible. And the stipulation was that if Savage and Piper won the match, they would have a match with each other. What ended up happening was they lost the match. Randy Savage submitted to the sharpshooter, and then Piper was trying to help Savage. Savage attacked him, and they ended up having the match anyways. And then Roddy Piper beat Randy Savage. So Savage lost 2 times in a row, and the next night on Nitro, he would be injured in a cage match by Eric Bischoff, and he would be out of action for several months. So Randy Savage basically written off of the storylines at this point. And then you had the tag team title match between Sting and the Giant, a one-on-one match for the tag team titles. The winner gets to choose a new partner. Really short match for a main event. It was only like 5 minutes. So pretty much a nothing match. Sting would win the title and would choose his partner, who would end up being Kevin Nash. Next up, we have the Bash at the Beach. So confusing with the bashes. You have the Great American Bash, you have Bash at the Beach. This show was decent. You had 2 very good undercard matches. You had Juventud Guerrera versus Kidman. Kidman was starting to come into his own in WCW. He was part of Raven's Flock, but he was the breakout star of the group, and he started having some very memorable matches in WCW, and he was really becoming one of the top cruiserweights around this time. You had Hair versus Hair, Eddie Guerrero versus Chavo Guerrero Jr. This storyline was very entertaining, as I'd mentioned earlier. Eddie Guerrero and Chavo, going back and forth in their feud. and Chavo essentially going nuts and just losing his mind. This was good stuff. And then you had the main event, the star-studded main event: Dennis Rodman and Hulk Hogan against DDP and Karl Malone. Um, the previous year's Bash at the Beach, you had the tag team match with Rodman and Hogan against the Giant and Lex Luger. That was a good match. This one, not so good. With two basketball players in there, it was up to Hogan and DDP to essentially carry the match, and it definitely struggled. Wasn't a complete embarrassment, but I wouldn't say it was that good. And I think WCW was really starting to go overboard with doing these celebrity matches. And I mean, it did a huge buy rate for WCW. It was one of their biggest pay-per-view buy rates. I think second biggest after the '97 Starrcade. But it did really well on pay-per-view. But it wasn't very good in the ring, to say the least. Next up, we have Road Wild '98. And if you thought that it was overkill with the basketball players in there, it got even worse. You had DDP and Jay Leno. Yes, Jay Leno wrestling against Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff. Star-studded match, but Jay Leno, really. I mean, at least with Rodman and Karl Malone, they're athletes. With Jay Leno, he's not an athlete, he's a comedian, and it's so ridiculous. I mean, watching Jay Leno have offense on Hulk Hogan, I mean, there's no way to suspend disbelief. I mean, it's just completely over the top. Total comedy match in the main event. Literally a comedy match, unintentional comedy. This was a train wreck. But if you like the train wreck stuff, you'll enjoy this. You had a battle royal. Goldberg had won the WCW title from Hulk Hogan, not on pay-per-view, but on Nitro for free. Nobody had to pay for it. And then Goldberg was thrown into an NWO Wolfpack and Black and White Battle Royal, just completely random. And the rest of the card was very forgettable. And your usual problem with Road Wild, where it was a nice idea on paper, but in terms of execution, it just didn't work that well. With the biker crowd, they're not really there to see WCW specifically. They're in town for the Sturgis rally, and they just go to the wrestling show because it's something to do. Moving on here, things really starting to get bad in WCW. You have this Fall Brawl pay-per-view, and the Ultimate Warrior in WCW's latest attempt to try and turn things around in the ratings war with WWE. They brought in the Ultimate Warrior, and you had a three-way 9-man tag team War Games match. So 3 different teams, Team WCW, DDP, Piper, and the Warrior, against NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack. This match was just a complete mess. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It was all over the place. You had the Warrior coming out. You had the smoke. The smoke apparently knocked everybody out, and when the Warrior left the ring through the smoke, or through his trap door, everybody was laid out, and the whole thing was just completely ridiculous in WCW. DDP ended up winning. This match was a mess. You had Chris Jericho versus a fake Goldberg. This was something you would expect to see on Nitro, not on a pay-per-view that you're spending a lot of money on to watch. Chris Jericho versus fake Goldberg on pay-per-view. Okay. You had Raven's Rules, Perry Saturn versus Raven. This was a good match. This was actually the best match on the show. And then you had the British Bulldog getting injured via the Warrior's trap door. I mean, that's the only other noteworthy thing on this show. The pay-per-view kicked off with Neidhart and the British Bulldog against Alex Wright and Disco Inferno, and Bulldog actually got hurt, because of the Warrior's trap door, which was used in the main event. This pay-per-view was pretty bad overall. Then we had Halloween Havoc '98 with perhaps the worst WCW pay-per-view main event of all time. Arguably the worst pay-per-view main event in WCW history. Hulk Hogan versus the Warrior, the big rematch from WrestleMania 6. But it was 8 years later, and WCW somehow managed to ruin the Warrior. The Warrior came in WCW and the fans went nuts for his debut, but one stupid angle after another, and the Warrior started getting booed by people because the storylines were just so ridiculous, and coming off a fall brawl and the whole mirror incident on Nitro, and then you had the match, and these two could not go in 1998. I mean, both of them way past their peaks, and Hogan tried to light a fireball to use it on the Warrior, and it went off in his hand before he could even use it. So yeah, it was embarrassing to watch. And you had Scott Hall versus Kevin Nash. Scott Hall was doing this drunk gimmick where he showed up to Nitro intoxicated, and they turned his real life problems into a storyline. But it was in bad taste. And this whole thing was just sad to watch for multiple reasons. You had Bret Hart versus Sting, which was really disappointing. You would think a match between Bret Hart and Sting, the Scorpion Deathlock versus the Sharpshooter would be an all-time classic, but it wasn't. And the build up to this match was Bret Hart had acted like he was turning on Hulk Hogan. Bret Hart and Hogan had a match on Nitro, but the whole thing was a setup. They were fighting each other as part of a setup. Sting came out to help Bret Hart, and then Bret Hart turned on him. So the whole Hogan and Bret Hart wrestling each other was just a swerve to set up Sting. This was the build-up to this match. It was very lame, and the match itself was lame. The best match on the show was actually the main event for once, which is a surprise because normally the undercard is really good and the main event is terrible. This time, the main event was actually really good. Goldberg versus DDP, probably Goldberg's best pay-per-view match, and he defended the WCW title successfully against DDP. Really good stuff here. And originally there was a whole big issue when this pay-per-view aired. The pay-per-view cut off during this match, and they ended up showing the match the next night on Nitro. And as it turns out, that would be the last time Nitro would ever beat Raw in the ratings. And it was all downhill from this point. Next up, you have World War III, Part 4. The Fourth World War III, whatever. Another bad WCW pay-per-view, another bad World War III pay-per-view. This would turn out to be the last one, and I think they did three more too many. Kevin Nash won the Battle Royal. I mean, the Battle Royal was fine. I mean, actually it was probably the best Battle Royal, just for the fact that, they had a good storyline here. Kevin Nash just eliminated a ton of people and dominated the match to become the number one contender for Goldberg. So, I mean, that was well done at least. And then you had the U.S. title, DDP versus Bret Hart. That was a good match. Everything else you can forget about. Starrcade 98. What were they thinking with this pay-per-view? It started off really good. It started off with a lot of potential. You had Kidman versus Juventud Guerrero and Rey Mysterio for the Cruiserweight title. I had forgotten about how good a match this was. When I watched it back, I was like, wow, this was a really awesome match. Kidman was at the top of his game. He had really come into his own as a major Cruiserweight superstar in WCW, and he had broken away from the flock. This was an excellent match. Highly recommended. One of the best WCW pay-per-view matches they ever put out. And it led to another match. Kidman would wrestle a second time against Eddie Guerrero. Another very good match. And then it was all downhill from this point. You can just watch the first two matches in the main event and pretty much skip the rest of this show. I mean, by this point, WCW was just throwing together matches randomly on pay-per-view. Matches that you wouldn't even want to see on Nitro. I mean, Bryan Adams and Scott Norton against Fit Finlay and Jerry Flynn on your Super Bowl pay-per-view, your pay-per-view that's supposed to be your version of the Super Bowl, and you have Jerry Flynn in a match? What? And then you had Eric Bischoff versus Ric Flair for control of WCW. But in typical WCW fashion, Ric Flair is made to look weak every single week leading up to the pay-per-view. Barry Windham turns on him. Eric Bischoff gets heat on him every single week. Ric Flair, they tease that he has a heart attack on Nitro as a ratings ploy. So all these things are happening to Ric Flair. So, of course, he loses in the big match at Starrcade. Kurt Hennig comes out, interferes, and Bischoff wins. And it leads to a match the next night on Nitro. Once again, another ratings ploy. Instead of doing the big Ric Flair victory on pay-per-view, they do something on Nitro instead. So why even get the pay-per-views if you know the payoff's going to be on Nitro and not the pay-per-view that you're spending money on? This was WCW's logic. They cared more about the ratings than they cared about making the pay-per-view special. And then you had the main event, Kevin Nash versus Goldberg, the end of Goldberg's undefeated streak in WCW. Scott Hall using the cattle prod, interfering in the match to cost Goldberg, and Kevin Nash would, right after he had become the real-life booker in WCW, he wins the WCW title. What a coincidence. All right, so that'll do it for this edition of WCW Wednesday. Next time, I move on to the year 1999, and that's when things really start to fall apart in WCW. So that'll be fun to look back on those shows. I'll see you guys next time for that.